This is the third in a three-part lecture on meritocracy. Here I will conclude my exploration of the meaning of meritocracy and its development as a system of government. In this lecture I draw from the book Benign Violence, Education in and Beyond the Age of Reason, published by Palgrave Macmillan. In Michael Young's 1958 dystopia, he explains how, as meritocracy matures, it graduates from administrative imperfection to a state that is increasingly just in its allocations. In an imperfect or newly established meritocracy, competition and ambition are to be allowed, if not encouraged, so that so-called genius can promote itself to the position it deserves. When meritocratic administration is perfected, and all members of the population are correctly allocated according to their position within the normal distribution, competition and ambition are no longer necessary. Indeed, excessive ambition could lead members of the population to interfere with the finely tuned allocations of advanced meritocracy. This apparently inevitable historical progression is what allows Young to reach his apocalyptic conclusion. A society that is justly unequal invites rebellion in a way that an unjustly unequal society does not. The transparency of administrative systems in advanced meritocracy provides an obvious target for revolt, especially when compared to the indeterminate and multiple forces of ill fortune that prevail in a less perfected meritocratic society. So, as Young appears to suggest, the principles of meritocracy are in the end self-defeating. Life for those further down the normal distribution in advanced meritocratic societies is intolerable, and the target for revolt is clear and explicit. Young's mistake, I think, was to assume that meritocracy is a universal ideal. This is still the mistake that many people make who treat it as an ahistorical idea. In the early 21st century, British society far from resembles the apocalyptic predictions of his book, precisely because the principles of meritocracy have changed. I will briefly outline 4 key areas in which meritocratic principles of government have changed. They can be summarized as follows. First, meritocracy no longer requires detailed administrative intervention. Second, human ability is seen as malleable. Third, competition within meritocracy is to be encouraged. And fourth, a perfect distribution of abilities is no longer required. So, to begin with the first principle, the idea that meritocracy no longer requires detailed administrative intervention. The move away from detailed administrative intervention is connected with changing modes of governance. Over the last quarter century or more, the practice of government has moved increasingly away from direct intervention and towards a mode of steering from a distance. In this new climate, citizens are encouraged to take greater responsibility for their lives as the state withdraws or appears to withdraw. The consequences for meritocracy are profound. In this revised political climate, direct human repositioning finds little support, as politicians are now keen to avoid the accusation of social engineer. Instead, individuals must take up the task of repositioning themselves. In this context, personal ambition is deemed essential. The second new principle: human ability is to be seen as malleable. Despite a certain degree of resistance amongst those who still believe that intelligence is largely determined at birth, the consensus seems to be that intelligence is reasonably malleable, if not multiple. This makes the business of meritocratic repositioning far more complicated than when intelligence is seen as fixed, unitary, and determined. Nevertheless, it could be assumed, for administrative purposes at least, as was outlined in an earlier part of this lecture, that human ability is relatively fixed and measurable. However, this assumption no longer fits with the dominant meritocratic logic that depends upon the perceived malleability of its subjects. Current meritocracy requires so-called mastery children, for instance, who believe that you can improve your intelligence if you try. Only those who believe they can perpetually improve can be depended on to make the constant effort to reposition themselves that is required once the social engineer retreats. Individuals must now attend to their own social mobility. Now to the third new principle, the idea that competition is to be encouraged. In Young's advanced meritocracy, competition was to be avoided. This view reflected the spirit of his time, the time of the 1950s, where competition between schools, for example, was to be deplored. In the early post-war years, variations in school esteem was considered to be a limiting factor that would interfere with administrative efforts to distribute children amongst schools according to their ability and tailor schooling to their aptitudes. Once schooling was provided for all at secondary age, so the logic went, competition would become an unnecessary evil and would have to be removed by achieving parity of esteem. This anti-competitive system looks odd to us now because we are familiar with a very different approach. In the second half of the 20th century, esteem was transformed from a limiting factor to be levelled at all costs to a principle of organisational enhancement, pitting schools against each other as they compete for high league table ranking. Competition has long since emerged from its formerly subordinate position and now operates at an individual as well as an institutional level. According to some critics who prefer what they see to be a more traditional educational order, recent trends in teaching and examination have sought to remove competition between individuals rather than encourage it. The rise in formative assessment may seem to be a case in point, where the use of qualitative feedback aims to replace ranking and numerical grades. According to Paul Black and Dylan William, who raised the profile of formative assessment a couple of decades ago now with their widely circulated report Inside the Black Box, as an educational technique, formative assessment is designed to replace a system where the classroom culture focuses on rewards, gold stars, grades, or place in the class ranking. This, they argued, makes pupils look for the ways to obtain the best marks rather than the needs of their learning. It also generates a fear of failure and leads to efforts by pupils to try to build up their self-esteem in other ways, as they write. We are told that, on the contrary, what is needed is a culture of success backed by the belief that all can achieve. This educational argument does not, however, remove competition from the classroom. Though confrontations with failure are to be avoided, this approach poses no challenge to competition itself, I think, which thrives on optimism. As a subsequent textbook on formative assessment argued, formative assessment encourages competitive practices, albeit in a carefully regulated form. Helpless children, who tend to avoid challenge, believing that they will fail, so it's written, are to be transformed through formative techniques into mastery children, who are confident of success, believing they can do it if they try. This is to be achieved by constructing a classroom environment employing educational techniques that allow pupils to learn how to communicate with their peers in non-judgmental ways. Pupils are trained in the techniques of benevolent and cooperative rivalry, where they peer assess and self-assess in order to develop their powers of self-analysis and self-enhancement. Competition does not disappear within the explicitly constructive and encouraging ethic of formative assessment. What retreats is the goad of ranking, or at least this is the hope. In its place, pupils learn how to enhance the learning process and develop themselves in apparent harmony with one another, each involved in personal formative cycles, occupied in unison within individual feedback action loops. They learn to become industrious self-improvers, accepting and implementing external goals. Competition is humanized and disguised and therefore intensified by this formative technology. Of course, elsewhere in the school system, competition has only become more brazen. Now to the fourth and last principle. This is the idea that a perfect distribution of abilities is no longer required. Once individuals are made responsible for their own meritocratic repositioning, after all, human ability is now seen as too malleable and complex in its formation to be administered by the social engineer. Well, once we get to this position, aspiration is to be encouraged in a context of competitive rivalry. A perfect distribution of abilities is no longer seen as feasible, nor is it required. This would demand a form of administrative intervention that no longer finds favour with systems of power. When individuals are made responsible for their own meritocratic repositioning, only an approximation of meritocratic perfection can be achieved. There is no longer any desire to manufacture a social machinery that will perfectly align the normal distribution of intelligence found within a population alongside a normal distribution of educational provision and a normal distribution of jobs. The current meritocratic logic is perhaps best symbolized by a study published in 2010 which reported that random job promotion is the best and most effective form of progression in large bureaucratic organizations. This is just the sort of research finding that one might expect to be celebrated in a system where the logic of scientific administration has been replaced by the more fragmented and capricious logic of ambition and competitive rivalry. A perfect distribution of individuals according to their relative ability is now felt to be unattainable. Whilst patronage still remains challenged or, for some, unthinkable, chance and self-promotion fill the gap to become the principles of meritocratic society. In this lecture, the principles of meritocracy contained within Michael Young's 1958 dystopia have been extracted and briefly explored. A deliberate attempt has been made to treat with the seriousness they deserve the more outlandish predictions of his book. If Young's work reflects the meritocratic philosophy of his times, we can assume from the vast distance that lies between his imagined future and our present that the meaning and practice of meritocracy have since changed. Meritocracy, once defined by a desire to achieve social efficiency through careful administrative repositioning, has, through shifts in government, reached a position where direct administrative intervention is on the retreat. In a state where ambition and competitive rivalry are to be promoted, the task for government has changed. The governmental task, I claim, is now chiefly educational and moral. In the current meritocracy, it's necessary to develop practices of self-care that can act to restrain hopes within safe channels. In Young's meritocracy, social unrest derived from the lack of room that was available to ambition. In today's meritocracy, the problem is its opposite. Beneath a symbolic order that works to stoke up unrealistic aspirations, mundane, everyday techniques for maintaining perspective are vital. Thus, the governmental task in recent years has been to develop practices of self-absorption which will ensure that aspiration drives effort within acceptable channels of restraint, preventing self-loss and subsequent dissatisfaction with the global order. Crucially, the systemic forces that produce and reproduce disadvantage must be kept hidden as personal responsibility takes the limelight.